We'll kick off right away. So welcome to Community Online Academy and welcome to 123 Lead with Charlie Coro. I'm super excited to introduce him today. He is a leadership facilitator, instructor, and consultant in the U.S. Coast Guard. And during his 26 years plus in the leadership development arena, he has worked with thousands of leaders in programs ranging from 1 week to 50-week durations. Charlie has developed more than 100 courses, workshops, and publications related to collaboration, leadership theory, facilitation, consulting, communications, conflict management, change management, and self-awareness. In 1998, he helped establish the Coast Guard's Leadership Development Center where he currently works. And in addition to his work in the Coast Guard, he has also consulted with numerous businesses, schools, and nonprofit organizations. And he is also a Leadership Academy alumni, so we're very excited to introduce and hand it over to Charlie today.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, everybody. So Laura, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I do have a slideshow and I put that in the chat and we'll put it in again at the end there so everybody can see the slides. So I always have to get used to having pictures in the way of my screen. So welcome. I'm excited to be with you. This presentation is something I put together to kind of synthesize some things. I think we're living in some tough times and some complex times. So I wanted to offer some simplicity and some synthesis of some ideas I've learned about over the last 26 plus years. One of the things I want to do first, though, is thank NextJump. I read the book about NextJump years ago, and I've been kind of intrigued for a long time. And then I had this wonderful opportunity to attend one of their leadership academies in person. And boy, was that amazing. So I actually, was kind of the geeky student who sat as close to Charlie as he could and soak up some of these great instructions that he and Megan present. And I tell you, it was just an amazing rejuvenation for me, having taught leadership for so long, to see leadership in practice, and the inspiration was really quite amazing. The culture at NextJump is tremendous, and just being able to meet, a couple of your heroes that are really doing great things for everyone, really. They're helping their communities is terrific. But before I move on, I think what they're doing with the Community Online Academy is also even better. I mean, now thousands of people are getting exposure. When I went through that academy, I think there was 20-something of us that got to go through that great experience. But now thousands of people are getting this great taste of this great organization. So hats off. And what you're going to find in my presentation is I think NextJump does pretty much everything that I'm talking about in this presentation. So back to this idea of simplicity. This is a quote I love from Oliver Wendell Holmes. And I think it's important when we think about the complexities of our world. Oftentimes people take a complex situation and they actually make it more complicated than it needs to be. I don't know why people do this, if it's to make them feel good about themselves, but they take some things that aren't really meant to be that hard and they make them harder. So if there's one thing I hope during this talk you'll get, is that there's ways to simplify this art of leadership, because really it's an art, and because there's so many variables involved in leadership in terms of the situation, the personalities, different people and their experiences. There's a lot of complexity, but we don't have to make it too hard. So I told you in this, if you read the advertisement, I think one of the most important things to kind of keep in the back of your mind is when people aren't meeting your expectations, we need to have a perspective on that. So I'm going to go back to 1993 in Princeton University. So they did an experiment. They had a professor who they asked if they could experiment with his graduate students. And what the setup for this experiment was, is they said to this professor, we know your students have to present on a thesis. What we want you to do is when they come to your normal presentation room to present this thesis, we want you to tell them that they've changed the venue and they have to go to the other side of campus now to present their thesis. So you can imagine people were not too happy to meet the professor when they're told that, hey, you're in the wrong place, you need to get to the other side of campus. And in some cases with the experiment, they gave the students very little time, and in some cases they gave them some time so that they'd not have to rush so much. Well, the real experiment happened in that path towards this new location. The experimenters put someone on the ground writhing in pain in need of medical assistance. And the students would have to pass by this person in need of medical assistance in order to get to the venue they're heading to. So as they were, probably out there with their clipboards watching and observing, what they found, and I think intuitively you can kind of predict what they found, the more rushed the students were, the more likely they were to skip on past this person in need of assistance. The more time they had, the more likely they were to stop and render assistance. So that's an interesting, kind of experiment. But what really kind of sealed this for me, I heard about it about 10 years ago. Why I keep repeating it to my class is because guess what school this was? This was the Princeton School of Divinity, and every one of those people being experimented on were divinity students, right? These are the future pastors and religious leaders in our country. So that was really telling. And then the really other telling part about this, and it's almost too trite and convenient. So if you go to the slides, you'll see I actually put the link to the research. The presentation they were about to give was about the story of the Good Samaritan. So when you think about that story, that experiment, what's really, to me, the key takeaway is these are probably good people with high morals. They knew the right thing to do. In fact, they were about to present about the right thing to do. Yet when I change the situation I put those people in, they do something that's bad, right? Walking past someone in need of medical assistance, I think most of us would say that's bad. But the key thing to remember is they're not bad people. They are just in a bad situation, right? They were put into blinders because of this experiment. So sometimes what happens is we don't give people the benefit of the doubt. And they call this the fundamental attribution error, right? When people do bad things, we often think that they have character flaws and there's some internal thing that's wrong with them. But the reality is a lot of times it's the situation people find themselves in. And when you find yourself in tough situations, you usually give yourself the benefit of the doubt, right? Has anybody ever driven like an idiot or swerved in front of someone by mistake? You say to yourself, you know what, boy, that was silly. I shouldn't have done that, but normally I'm a good driver, right? You give yourself the benefit of the doubt, but if someone ever does that to you on the road, we have all kinds of things to talk about and call that person. So when you're thinking about the one thing to remember, I want you to remember this quote, right? Everyone you meet is fighting a hard battle. And when people do things that tick you off and make you angry, just remember, you don't know what situation they happen to be in, what's going on. So quick story, I'm gonna put Laura on the spot here. Yesterday, I was kind of being nervous. I said, hey, can we just have a quick call? She arranged with it. She's gonna call me at 3:30. I said, awesome. And she goes to call me, and guess what? Charlie doesn't answer his phone. So, she's expecting, and then I looked at my phone finally about 15, 20 minutes later. I'm like, oh geez, that must have been Laura trying to call me. I completely spaced it out. Well, I'm sure Laura had a ton of things to do yesterday getting ready for this session. And here's the one presenter that she's got to do a quick check-in with. He's not even answering his phone when he arranged to have this phone call at this time. So there's all these little, minor things that happen to people. And if we allow ourselves every time one of those things happens to kind of get spun up and frustrated with how people are letting us down on our expectations, we're going to drive ourselves crazy, right? So we're not going to correct people like me who might be forgetful and not answer our phone when we're supposed to. So what we really need to do is just remember, people make mistakes. I'm going to assume positive intent. Charlie didn't intentionally disregard me and set up a phone call he wasn't going to answer. So I want to talk about one of the thought leaders in this field of organizational development. His name's Peter Drucker, and he has, I think, my favorite quote in leadership. And it's kind of depressing when you read the beginning there, right? The only three things that happen naturally in organizations are friction, confusion, and underperformance, right? So you're going to have a lot of strife and problems in the workplace. But what Peter Drucker does, the reason I love this as a leadership quote, is he says, everything else requires leadership. So when you're getting people not meeting your expectations, right, think about what a leader would do to answer that call, that need, right? And so that's an important concept that I want you to think about is, how can I take this friction, confusion, and underperformance and bring a leadership perspective to it and not assume bad intent or that people are naturally bad and trying to wrong me in some way. So I also think that one of the most important aspects about leadership is trust, right? And all that is a foundation of relationships. So one of the things that I love about this field I've been in for so many years is the more I think about leadership concepts and apply them to the key relationships in my life, the better I do. So let me tell you about one of the key relationships I have. And I say that this is the most extreme form of assuming good intent, is this idea of having unconditional positive regard. So Carl Rogers, a famous psychologist, came up with this years ago. And I think when I think about my relationship with the most important relationship in my life, there's my wife, Julie. We got married July 21st, 1990. And she wouldn't be happy if I told her I was posting this next picture. But last July 1st, 2020, we were celebrating our 30th wedding anniversary. So this is us in New Hampshire after a very long hike. That's why she wouldn't be happy for me to be sharing this picture. But we've been married for 30 years. And I think all the things I've learned about relationships and leadership have really helped me in terms of my relationship with the most important person in my life. So the point is, when you're trying to think about assuming positive intent, the best thing you can do is really try to embrace this idea of unconditional positive regard. In other words, I care about you, and the fact that you messed up that project, I'm going to let that go because I care about you. You're a good human being, and you have, good intent, and you want to do good things for us. So to kind of summarize this first principle, I want you to assume positive intent. That is one of the most important things you do when people aren't meeting your expectations. Tell yourself a positive story. Okay, so someone didn't return my call. Someone, has not returned my email in like 3 weeks, and it's a crucial bit of information I need. Assume they're busy, they're struggling, they have other priorities, they're in situations that are keeping them distracted, and assume that positive intent, because that's one of the first principles that we need to keep in mind. The second thing I want to talk about is when we're assessing people we work with. So let me take a pause here, and let me also say I'm on a roll now, and I told Laura when I talked to her yesterday, at about, when we have about 15 minutes left, she's going to chime in and let me know that I've been talking too much. But I do want to have time for Q&A. It's just kind of hard to do when I can't see your faces to think about questions and answers right now. So I want you to think about these two key areas. Whenever you're working with someone, there's two key things we need to think about in terms of their development. Where they're at in terms of growing in the job and the responsibilities they have in the workplace. So again, I'm going to tell you a quick story here. Those of you from New York might recognize this location. This is Governor's Island, New York. And back in 1989, when I got stationed there, it was a Coast Guard base. It was one of our biggest, most expansive Coast Guard bases. It was also probably the coolest place you could get stationed in the Coast Guard from my perspective, because we got to take all the advantage of the city. We enjoyed New York City the first 2 years of my career in the Coast Guard, yet we got to come to this nice remote place that was away from the city. So it was pretty idyllic. I encourage you, if you are in the area or if you visit New York City, you can now take the ferry over as a guest, and it's a park. So it's this beautiful park with artist displays and exhibitions. It's really a cool place that New Yorkers can go and and it actually looks different. I don't have the updated picture, but there's campgrounds there and hills that they built. It's really pretty remarkable what they did. So I graduated from the Coast Guard Academy, as Laura said, in 1989. I had training to be what they call an officer of the deck and to learn how to drive a ship. But I also was courting my wife. This was before we got married. And, we were pretty excited to be stationed in New York. And after we got married, it's where we had our first apartment in the top right corner of Governor's Island there. They had this really neat complex, and we had a nice 2-bedroom apartment overlooking Buttermilk Channel. It was a pretty nice setup. All that to say that I had a job when I was there, and that was to drive this ship. This ship is called the Coast Guard Cutter Sorrel. And there you see it in all its glory. And that's what was my first assignment right out of college. And I tell you, it was one of the most demanding and hard things that I've ever done in my life. Even this picture you're looking at was me acting as the public affairs officer to get someone to take a picture of our ship so we could put it on a Christmas card. I had we call him the shitty little job officer, SLJO. I had all these responsibilities, and not just those responsibilities, but I was also supposed to learn how to drive this ship. And so I went through a lot of strife and turmoil with all these responsibilities and trying to drive the ship without running into the Staten Island Ferry or any other traffic in this really busy harbor. So there I was in 1989 to 1991, learning how to drive this ship. And I got to tell you, these 4 stages of competence really came to play for me. When I started out, I was what they call unconsciously incompetent, right? I didn't know what I didn't know, and that felt okay, right? It was kind of exciting to be in New York City, to have this responsibility. I just graduated from college, but I didn't know what I didn't know. And guess what they did when I got there? They swamped me with responsibilities, and they showed me how bad I was going to be at driving this ship. So I quickly became consciously incompetent. And that, I will tell you, is the worst place to be. And as a leader, when you're working with other folks, right, whether they're teammates, their peers, or they're your direct reports, when people reach this stage of conscious incompetence, that's where you really have to earn your stripes as a leader and really, intensely care about them and make sure that you're working with them to get them through this second stage of competence. once people are given some opportunities to practice, right, and I was able to drive the ship, you know, they'd never let me drive it without someone over my shoulder kind of watching me and telling me what to do. But over some time, I started picking up some pretty good habits, and I got into the better ways to drive the ship, and I learned from watching other folks. And, you know, I was very laser focused on how to do this better. So over time, I got a little bit better, but I was what they would say consciously competent, meaning I could do it, but boy, did it take a lot of mental energy. And by the end of the day, I was drained. It just drained everything. If I had 1 hour of driving the ship, I really felt drained by that experience. And then finally, and I wouldn't say that in 2 years I arrived at this stage, but when people do things repetitively and get really good at them, they become consciously competent, or unconsciously competent, I mean. So this is you driving your car, right? These are those repetitive tasks we do that we get so good at them that we don't even have to think about it while we're doing it. So I want to tell you that because this really feeds into those two key things we have to care about when we're developing people, working with the people on our teams and our direct reports. This conscious incompetence is really a key stage. So what's happening when we're in conscious incompetence is we have low motivation and low ability. And these are the two watchwords I want you thinking about. So in other words, when I got overwhelmed with all these tasks and was told all these things I had to do, I could not keep up with it, and I felt like a failure. My motivation had plummeted. Not to mention the fact that I just wasn't good at it. I didn't know what the heck I was doing. I was constantly failing. So when you're having low motivation and low ability, you are at the bottom of the growth cycle, and you really need to have some leadership, some coaching. And this is something that NextJump just has built into its system, right? When people are struggling, they have constant feedback mechanisms to help folks, and you have your talking partner, so there's always some partner or someone there who can kind of help you get through that. Not all organizations think about that and get that involved. So we need to, as leaders in our organizations, think about what do we do to address when people have low motivation and low ability. So I will say, just to simplify, and by the way, this is really derivative of the Hersey Blanchard situational leadership model. They were the originals. If you read organizational behavior books, you'll see Blanchard and Hersey wrote the foundational work on this, and they took human development, those competence development stages, and they matched it with leader behaviors that you need to do to work within that. So what we need to do when people lack motivation, we need to provide inspiration and support. And when they lack ability, this one's actually easier. We just need to provide instruction. So what does that mean to provide inspiration and support? If you're a fan of Simon Sinek, Start with Why, that's a big one, right? Giving people the bigger picture. A big why will help people stay motivated when they hit those doldrums and low motivation times, right? When they're really failing constantly. The instruction piece is tough for some leaders because sometimes we have people working for us that we don't know how to do their job, right? They're so technically competent in their job and it's so specific that we actually as leaders don't know how to do their job. So it's incumbent upon us as leaders to provide them the support they need. Maybe we send them to training or match them up with a partner, like a talking partner or someone that can give them the direct instruction they'll need to do their job, right? Set them up in a developmental assignment so the stakes aren't so high. So be thinking about this motivation and ability and how you can work that into your leadership. So I just have a little point to remember here, and this is a great evolution, right? As people are starting out in their jobs, we are teaching and inspiring them, right? Our goal should be teaching and inspiring for those starting out periods of their jobs. And then when they get that competence, we need to start trusting and admiring them, right? Make them the trainers, put them on the pedestal to present to the big clients and these kinds of things. So think about this spectrum of teaching and inspiring to trusting and admiring the folks. And if you can kind of flow as people grow into those roles, you're going to be a much more effective leader. Where leaders fail is they don't adjust, right? I teach and I inspire you really well, but then once you gain all that competence, I don't stop teaching you and I don't stop talking to you, right? And now you start feeling, once you have the competence, you feel like you're not trusted if the boss is always checking in with you. So you need to have that conversation and gauge people's ability and motivation. One last thing on motivation, because it's so important, right? I always teach my students, the fact is you can't motivate people. Really, people do things for their reasons, not yours, right? And the worst thing you can do is provide extrinsic factors to get people to be motivated to do a job. So Daniel Pink wrote this book, which I think really synthesizes the key ideas of motivation. And if you want the shorthand, you can just think about amping up the workplace. So anytime I think that I'm in a low motivation kind of workplace or situation, I think of what kind of autonomy do people need to have, right? Is there a situation where I can put them in a position where they have autonomy to make their own decisions, their failures and successes are kind of on them. People want to naturally grow, so finding opportunities for people to master a task, master a certain complex skill. Mastery is something that is part of our human nature. We just want to grow and learn. And then finally, I've already talked about start with why, right? So people want to work for a bigger purpose. You know, that's where I'm blessed. Working for the U.S. Coast Guard has been wonderful for me. We're a humanitarian service. We do some great things for the public. And I'm just really proud to be, you know, in that service mindset working for this great organization. So, you know, that's something in the Coast Guard I find our leaders are pretty good at. If you're in an organization where you're feeling like it's a little bit more detached, you have to find that bigger purpose, right? And communicate that to folks. And remember, it's going to be different for everybody. So don't assume what motivates you is the same as what's going to motivate the folks you work with. So the two key areas, just to reinforce this idea, is motivation and ability. And ability is one of those things where once you have a trusting relationship with somebody and they know that you care about their growth, they'll let you know that they're struggling. The motivation, I think, takes more finesse. That's where the art of leadership comes in, because you have to really kind of understand the bigger picture and understand what values this person has that you're trying to influence. But keep it simple, just those two things. If you can assess that and if you can keep that in the conversation with the folks you work with, they'll be able to tell you, hey, you know what? I'm really at that low motivation for this specific task. And that's another thing to remember, right? I might be great at 50% of my job just naturally, but there might be certain tasks that just are not easy for me. Maybe I don't do them frequently enough. So my ability might be low. And because I have low ability and don't sense that success, my motivation starts to go down as well too. So remember that key stage, number 2, where you're consciously incompetent, right? I know that I don't know. That's the key stage for leaders to step in and coworkers to step in and help people out, right? Because as we take new people on board, we need to kind of build into the program that they're going to go through these stages. And by the way, just as an aside, when we're developing teams, you've all probably heard of the team development model by Bruce Tuckman called Form, Storm, Norm, Perform. Well, that falls right in line with those 4 development areas as well, right? So when you find things starting to cross over, what you realize then is that's the truth, right? Things that cross over from one concept to another and some research to another bit of research, that means that there's some real good truth there and some face validity to those kind of concepts. So now we'll finish up. I think I'm going at a pretty quick clip here, and I'm going to take a pause. Laura, are there any comments I need to address at this point? Or we're streaming along pretty good?
Streaming along good.
All right, thanks, Laura. So this is these 3 questions I think are the most important thing. And when I was structuring this presentation, I thought maybe I should start with this. I've been presenting, to thousands of people over the years, and over the last couple of years, I've started using these 3 questions as a way to orient them to the new leadership lessons they're about to learn in like a 2 or 3 week course we might be teaching them in the Coast Guard. So these are really important questions, and I'm going to challenge you to think about, do the people I work with know the answers to these questions for me? Because if they don't know the answers to these questions for you, I would say you've got some work to do and some thought to put behind these questions. So the first question, well, here's the 3 questions, and I do need to give a little promotion to one of my favorite leadership books, and one that I use extensively in our Coast Guard leadership development programs. It's called The Leadership Challenge. It's been around for 30 plus years now, and Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner really created kind of an industry around these 5 practices of exemplary leadership. And being someone who's worked in leadership development for as long as I have, I can tell you sometimes organizations fall into this management by bestseller. You know, the top leader might have read a book and they think that book is the end all be all and it's the one we should all be following. And, you know, that's never the case. But I have to say this book and this kind of open-ended model they have around leadership is really powerful. And I found that we've been using it now, I think, for about 14 years. And it's really fit a lot of the key needs that we've had in our organization. So one of the things they talk about is based on a lot of research, there's 3 essential questions that people want answered from their leaders. The first one is, who are you? They want to know not just who you are from your experience and your background, but tell us a little bit about your personality, your values, things that maybe you don't normally share with other folks. Where are we headed? People want their leaders to take them to a place. So where you're taking your people is really important. And so to give that some thought and tell them this is where we're going, and bring it on as a shared vision, right? Bring them into that where we're headed conversation. But they want a leader that's going to take them to a place. Obviously, a better place is what they're striving for. And then what are you going to do? You know, how are you going to lead me? How are you going to try to influence our team? What are your daily practices? We're going to talk about habits a bit for that question. So that first question, who are you? I don't know how many of you could really answer this well, but I'm going to give you some perspective. And I had an opportunity the last couple weeks. I've been working with a group of educators in a digital literacy institute that the University of Rhode Island sponsors. And these folks were wonderful. I was librarians, media specialists, teachers, and I didn't get to see them, right? I was teaching like I'm teaching now. We did it all virtually. So I wanted to do something to build a learning community. So I decided to ask this question during a orientation session early, about 5 weeks earlier. I said, can you help me understand who you are and help your classmates here understand who you are, since we're not going to be physically together. We're not going to have that time to have like little side conversations as easily as we might have in a physical environment. So I had them create a slide. Whoops. And I wanted to model the way. So I put out a slide first, and I said, here's my example of who I am. And if you went to this slideshow, you would see that in the notes, I kind of explain what these pictures mean to me. And I'm not going to bore you with all that, but if you're looking at this slide, this is a slice of my life. And you can see my values kind of on the left side, right? So on the left side of this picture, I said, those are the things that kind of drive me. That's what's important to me. And then there's a lot of pictures that summarize my experiences. And I talk about those pictures and what those experiences mean to me. You should recognize in the bottom there, that's a picture of New York City from afar. And you know, it's my favorite city. So I always talk about how that shaped me. And my daughter now lives in New York City, so we get to visit there quite often. And then in the bottom right, you'll see that I have some personality information. Now, I had to explain this to some of these students who hadn't been exposed to all these personality models, but I encourage you to really think about what personality factors cause you to behave in certain ways and might also give you some blind spots or weaknesses in how you approach leadership and interacting with people. A lot of people, I think it's like a favorite pastime now for academics to poo-poo personality tests, right? If I can shoot down this personality test or that personality test, you know, I can make a name for myself or something. But the reality is there's no perfect personality test. But what good personality tests do is they give you some reference points so that you can have conversations with people from common areas. So I'm a fan of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. I've used that for years. My wife and I, when we were, I think, probably 6 years into our relationship, went to an MBTI couples workshop, and we still talk about it to this day, about how we're different in certain ways. Our daughters are different in certain ways. So I'm a big fan of Myers-Briggs. If you're in the Coast Guard, you know, we use this thing called the DISC model, which is more of a behavioral assessment, and it only has 4 key areas. So when people know the DISC model, I tell them I'm a high steadiness with influence. And then when I teach with educators, they have a free assessment called Compass Points, and that, you know, overlaps with some of these other ones. So I'm a Southeast in that perspective, and that was big in this educator lesson I did last week. And then the Big 5 personality, I think, is the most accepted by the psychological community. So the Big 5 looks at some 5 key areas that Golden Allport noted years ago. So my point is this: you need to understand your personality. I think we all agree that people are different. I think they've even tested a lot of these things with fMRI caps on people's heads to say, you know, how we're wired is a little bit different. Blood flow in our brain is different in certain situations, whether it's introversion, extroversion, things like that, our thinking and feeling functions. But the point is, when I can share that with folks and they know these models, when I say I'm an INFP to someone who really understands Myers-Briggs, they just got a quick shorthand about what Charlie's strengths are and some areas where I might be able to help him out. It's a quick way to build a relationship. So another, I have permission from Mary Kate, one of my students from last week. She's a teacher in New York. So she made a great slide. And what I loved about her slide was, you know, she personalized it pretty nice, but she also did some personality stuff. She has these great quotes from Joseph Campbell, which really, you know, intrigued me about her. The top left is one of her favorite places up in New York. But she really embraced this, this assessment called the VIA, Values in Action. So if you Google this VIA, Values in Action assessment, you can take their test for free. And this is based on the positive psychology work that Martin Seligman has done at the University of Pennsylvania. Really great way to get a quick assessment of what's important to you, but more importantly, it also shows what's not important to you. And if your team shares where their values are, it can be a great conversation where, you know, for example, one of my top values is humor. So joking around. So the fact that I'm joking around in the workplace might not, you know, jibe with a lot of my coworkers. But if I can share with them that is a top value that I have, and I like to have fun at work, then they're going to be more understanding of me. But I also have to value the fact that they don't appreciate it, right? If it's one of their lower ones, I'll say, okay, well, that guy I'm not going to joke around with so much because it's not important to them. So I really encourage you to think of some form or fashion way to share who you are. In this you know, virtual environment, this kind of activity actually works better than you might appreciate. So I encourage you to try something like this. I'm trying this in my workplace now. I'm trying to get everyone on our team to make a slide so that we can get to know each other better, because we have 80 some people at our Leadership Development Center, and some work in California, some work in Virginia, some work in Connecticut with me. So it's hard to keep us all together. So if I had a way to kind of get to know people asynchronously, that might be helpful to me. All right, so let's get into this next question. Where are we headed? I said earlier, people want leaders to take them to a place. And again, I'm gonna just give you a quick way to analyze this. It sounds esoteric and important, gap analysis, but essentially it's just basically saying, I need to get a really good footprint of where I am currently, and then I need to transition to where I want to be in the future, right? So current state to desired state is really the rudimentary way we look at this. And they call that a gap analysis, right? So the more detailed you get in describing the current state and the desired state, maybe the more effective you can be. But what I want to do is just get you an example of again, what I used last week in a class I taught online, where I was talking to students about inspiring a shared vision and the power of using imagery to do that. So when we use imagery to describe a place we're trying to get to, a vision of a place we want to get to, it kind of brings some more emotion to it and more feeling to it, and people will buy into your vision a little bit better. If you ever get a chance to re-listen to Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, he paints a picture in that speech using his language, right? He takes us across the country to all the mountaintops and describes children holding hands. And the imagery he uses in that speech, I think, is one of the ways it becomes such a powerful speech for everyone. And it, you know, it was revolutionary in its time. So with that, I want to tell you another thing I did during this workshop, where we got people to describe their current state and their desired state. And we did it with images. So here was one of my students who was, you know, he was that just didn't communicate well, right? So you can see on the left, bad communication, on the right, better communication. This was someone who was trying to develop a program, and the way they looked at it, and what I loved about this is because we had a conversation about this vision. I love the fact that we had a conversation about how some people love Venice, right? They love that current state of Venice, where it's more free form and artistic and crowded and noisy and maybe very unorganized. And her vision of getting people all in a row and working this direction might be something that will drive a good conversation with that team to say, like, that doesn't look like fun. You know, Venice looks like fun. So then we can have that imagery conversation into a deeper conversation about, well, what are we going to do to make the picture on the right more fun? You know, what we love about the Venice picture is the fun. Let's see how we can bring that over, right? And maybe they add an image. So here's another one, right? Where you know, one is more static and the other one is more agile and responsive, right? So you can see where this leader is trying to shift the focus of his organization. I couldn't leave this one out. This is one of my favorites, right? And if I was to think about some of my students, this is my vision for a class I'm teaching, right? I want people to move from that left side to the right side, right? Where they're getting me. So hopefully some of you are more on that right side as you listen to this presentation. This is another one where we had a great conversation because the person said, I love spelunking. I think that's what they call it, right? So, you know, cave dwelling and all that is fun. A lot of people love that adventure, but that's not where he wanted his organization, right? This was someone who worked in New Mexico. He wanted to shift it over, and to them, this imagery around balloons is important, right? That's big in New Mexico. So we wanted to kind of acknowledge there's some good things about our current state, but let's see how we can grow and be more aspirational on this right-hand side. And I think this one speaks for itself. This was someone who was struggling, being overworked and overburdened and coping with working online from March till, this day. And it was just really swamped with too many things, right? So this was her personal vision of where she was trying to get. So do a gallery walk. We call this a gallery walk. And I used to do it in my live classroom with I had about 300 cardstock pictures that we'd strew about the room, just general pictures. And people would pick pictures that spoke to them and then use that to give some visual language to their vision for the future. So this is an important concept. Where are we headed? Where are we trying to get to? And if you're trying to create this shared vision, you want to bring other people into that conversation. So now this question of what are you going to do? This is an important one, right? And I always throw in there, because this comes from Kouzes and Posner's research, right? People want to know, how am I going to be treated? What's the leader going to do differently when they come to work with us? Because there's always this underlying question of, to me, right? How am I going to be affected, right? If I work for a boss who is very introverted, am I going to be getting tons more email now? Or if I work for a boss who's very extroverted, am I going to be getting phone calls and all these face-to-face meetings all the time and never really get into a good, consistent mode for my day? So people want to know the answer to this question. And I find that one thing you need to look at is your habits, right? Habits are really important. And I think if you look at the current writing that's out there, there's some really good resources on it. Each one of these authors, by the way, has some great podcasts, and I haven't mentioned that yet, but I don't read as much as I listen nowadays. So the podcast of these authors is great, and you can really see how you can sow some really good habits that will make you more effective in the workplace and make you more effective and approachable to the people you work with. So here's just something I want to leave you with, and I'm almost done here. I want you to think about what habits can you construct to change who you are by doing things different, behaving different. So, I don't think doing stuff is really essential to being an effective leader. Being a certain way is what's effective, right? And if I was to think of Megan and Charlie and how they run NextJump, there's a certain way of being, right? They're transparent, they're sharing, they're educators, they're teaching, right? They're doing all these great things. And the things they're doing, though, are they're having these workshops, they're doing feedback sessions, they're doing coaching sessions. They're consistently having people do things that also contribute to who they are as an organization. So if you're trying to be more caring and compassionate, you really need to schedule weekly one-on-one meetings, right? If you're not meeting with people weekly, and by the way, on my team, we're meeting daily because we're so, separated. Many of us are just looking at computer screens. You really need to consider that. And when you're having meetings, have certain meetings where you're just listening. What we would say is you're in the inquiry mode, not the advocacy mode, right? Many of us fall in advocacy. We're talking about our perspective and what's on our mind, right? But if you're truly in an inquiry mode, you're going to be in a more good, curious listening mode, and that's important. If you want to be organized, and this is one thing that I strive for, but I never quite achieve it, project and time management. There's some good stuff in there, but there's certain habits you can start formulating to make you more organized. And if you want to be more thoughtful and in tune, be open to feedback. Find avenues to get more feedback. And I know Laura's going to tell you about how I'm going to get some feedback for this workshop. But they've built a system at NextJump for getting feedback. But I would just encourage you to find ways you can get feedback. Do some things to make yourself more mindful and centered with meditation, guided meditation. I learned sleep meditation when I got to go to the NextJump Academy. I still use that. I think it's a wonderful habit that they actually have a sleep academy. And then obviously reading good stuff, taking the time to slow down and read. Maybe some of you have picked up that habit since your lives have slowed down since this pandemic. And then if you want to be more open and transparent, you got to model the way, right? So by me showing you the slide and me sharing with my team, here's the slide of me with my personal life and a little story behind it. I'm modeling a way that says, I want to share who I am, but I expect you to be transparent with me as well, right? And so I'm going to end with that, I think. Oh, I have a bonus here. So I wanted to stay to my 3, but if you want to remember 5 things, I've talked up this book pretty much. The 5 things that they talk about in this, it's a pretty thick book, but really the principles are modeling the way, inspiring a shared vision, challenging the process, enabling others to act, and encouraging the heart, right? So if you can remember, I even call the acronym MICE, right? If you want to remember the acronym. When there is friction, confusion, and underperformance happening in your work area, how can you bring leadership into that situation? And these 5 words might say, I should be more inspirational. Or I don't think I'm enabling people. I keep being frustrated by people missing deadlines. Maybe I'm not enabling them. Maybe I'm not reducing the workload. So you need to think about what aspects of leadership you need to bring into certain situations. So I think with that, oh, and this is a quote I just got today, actually, from my daughter's boyfriend, but I love it, right? Because this idea of simplicity. Pick a simple idea, like answering those 3 questions, or really assessing the ability and motivation of the people you work with, or really trying to assume positive intent, telling yourself a story in your head saying, I'm going to twist this story I'm telling about this person who I think is not a good person to say, you know what, they're just in a bad situation, right? So take one of these simple ideas, but take it seriously and get into a habit. And I would say the best thing you can do is share with the people you work with, the people you live with, that you're working on these things. Because when you're working on something like this and you share it with other folks, you'll feel more accountable to actually following through on these simple ideas, right? So keep it simple, right? Things are complex, but we don't need to make them complicated. And with that, I think I'm on my time, or actually a little bit ahead of schedule, Laura, so I'm open for questions.
Awesome, brilliant. So I noticed earlier in the chat that we had a couple of questions. So I'm going to see, so Yan, if you are still on the call, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Still here? And if not, Yan, while
Hello?
you're giving. Oh,
hello, can you hear me?
yes.
Hey, thank you for the presentation. That was really good. I have a question actually for my husband. He can make the video because he's at work. But I want to ask you, what if, because he's been very frustrated with his subordinate, that he feel he doesn't have enough ability to accomplish the work and he doesn't have enough motivation. Yeah, so he said he's tired of mentoring him. His job is a high technical job, but he is expecting with a master degree, he should be able to complete, but he just
Right. So,
yeah.
so what I didn't talk about is accountability, right? So there are times when people just aren't meeting the requirements, and there's a great book I would recommend called Crucial Accountability by Carrie Patterson and a number of other authors. But we teach around that. And when people don't do their job, I would still bring him back to assume positive intent, right? So this might be a situation where the person got hired and maybe their resume was a little bit more embellished than it should have been. And they're finding like they might have, not met all the things they put on their resume. So then you put people on developmental plans, right? So if someone is lacking ability and motivation, that means I need to make sure they understand what's important about this job, how it's impacting other people. And then I also need to basically give them the instruction so they can do their job. And if you go back to the autonomy, mastery, and purpose, that key model, I would argue that giving people autonomy, once you've trained them, giving them autonomy so they feel the pain of a failure. I find that NextJump does this amazingly, right? They just give people these massive projects like, you're going to run the next leadership academy, and good luck with that, and you're going to learn by putting yourself out there, right? Stretching yourself. That motivates folks. But what I find is a lot of times leaders will coddle folks, right? They'll protect them, and they'll like, hey, check with me, give me the draft, and then I'll make sure it's right before you go brief the big boss, and these kinds of things. No, have them feel the pain of failing in front of the big boss. If they're on a team, have them feel the pain of writing code that fails, right? All their teammates, they let down their entire team. Now, as a leader, you got to be strategic, right? So you don't want to put it in a high-risk situation where they're dealing with external customers. But if you put them in these kind of low training kind of environments, and you let them fail and let the peer pressure, not the boss pressure, but the peer pressure or the customer pressure impact, that sometimes motivates folks. But ultimately, you have to hold people accountable. So I'm not really addressing that now. So assume positive intent, but also give them the natural consequences to them not doing the job, right? So you start explaining to them, when you're not meeting these requirements, here's what's happening, right? So they understand the consequences. And you tell them ahead of time, and by the way, if this continues, I'm going to give you the warning. If this continues, then you go into that. This is when you need to he needs to talk to the HR department, right? And make sure that he can follow through on these consequences, because when you put people on performance plans and things like that, you got to make sure you do that in an equitable, fair, legal way, So bring HR in, but then tell the person, like, this is how we correct these things. So if this isn't important enough to you to spend the time getting better, eventually we're not going to be able to waste time. The other great thing I learned, and I learned this from Charlie and Megan, I think Charlie said he got it from a school, but this idea that we often let our top performers go and just perform on their own and we don't give them much attention. And those bottom performers take all of our spare time as leaders. And we spend a lot of time working with these marginal performers that are really struggling. You need to flip it. And those folks that are really great performers, work more with them and you'll actually get someone, and this is what Charlie says, right? You'll get someone who's like working at 90% and you can bring them up to 120% performance. You can bring them up so they're actually contributing so much more. But the tendency is to address that problem person and invest a lot of time and attention to the problem person, when the reality is, no, we're gonna give you a minimal amount of time. We're gonna be very clear on our expectations for you, where you're failing. We're gonna give you a coach. We're gonna give you someone to help you get better. But after that, we're done. And this is where your husband might be experiencing, this guilt of, I want to help this person. But at some point he might just be able to say, I'm going to assign you a coach. I've worked with you. I'm going to assign you a coach. We're going to put you on a performance plan, and then accountability needs to happen, right? And that's where you really have to have an equitable, fair, HR driven kind of approach.
Yeah, so, he's already on the development plan, and my husband still doesn't feel happy with him, but yeah.
The other thing to remember is to don't take it personal, right? And this is where assume positive intent, right? Because what happens is, if your husband is fixating on this non-performer, he's probably not giving the attention to his strong performers or to the job that he needs to do. So, it's a different perspective, right? And you got to take the emotion out of performance counseling. So a lot of people get frustrated, like it's a personal affront that they're not doing their job. But the reality is, take the emotion out of it. Hey, you have a helper there, it looks like.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much.
Yeah, good to talk with you. Are there any other questions, Laura?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Jill Hobby, if you're still on the line, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question as well. Dr. Jill is still here.
I'm looking at the chat now, and I love this idea of failure as a motivating factor.
Hello.
There's this idea of flow that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi put out. It's a positive psychology term. And the idea is, when you can match someone's skill level to the amount of challenge you give them, there's this magical spot, we call it the flow channel, where my amount of skill is matched up with the amount of challenge you're giving me. And I'm in this absorbing task, right? And it's like the ultimate state of being. When you're being challenged and your skill is meeting that challenge, that is like this ultimate state. But the only way to grow into that is to challenge yourself, right? To push on your skills, right? So think about any hobbies or interests you have. When you think about those things that are really kind of challenging, one of the things you enjoy about it is it's absorbing, right? When you're doing something harder, maybe you're a surfer or a golfer, you're constantly challenged by it to the point where you can lose yourself in the task. Well, the same thing can happen in the workplace, right? Losing yourself in the task can happen in the workplace when the boss meets the challenge with the skill. And I can tell you, having watched the folks who put on the Leadership Academy when I was at Next Jump, they were being challenged, right? This wasn't their normal job, yet they were thrust into this assignment. They were put in front of crowds of people and things. And I can tell you, they probably weren't thinking about other stuff. They were pretty focused on that task. And, having a supportive environment where you're allowed to fail, and even the boss is like demonstrating failure in some cases and admitting his failures, that makes it a safe place to fail. So I don't know if that completely answered, but I just glanced at the chat and saw that one question.
I do think we have Dr. Jill here ready to go.
Yes, Dr. Jill.
Hello, excellent presentation. And we are all in agreement. You need to come back and do some more sessions. So everyone's been saying that in the chat.
Oh,
so
good.
my question,
I'm trying not to look at the chat.
Okay, my question is, what would effective motivation look like for a low performer who is unconsciously aware versus one that is aware? How might that look differently?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say when you feel that failure, right, putting them into that situation of embarrassment and failure is when you become consciously competent. Or consciously incompetent, right? So you might even consider, and I haven't thought about this, but it's a good question. You might consider, making people quickly, consciously incompetent around certain tasks. Throw them into things. And, you know, if you have a fun kind of experimental mode of how you are, that is going to come across much better. And just a quick Coast Guard story. I have a friend who became the commanding officer of one of our new icebreakers. And I don't want to tell too many more details because you might be able to figure out who it is. So to make a long story short, this is a brand new ship that he didn't allow the team to fail in a safe environment, like out in the open ocean, so that when they got into a tight scenario and they hadn't really tested out how to drive this ship and how it performed, they ran into a barrier. They basically crashed the ship into a wall. So, and I talked to one of my friends who was on the ship. He said, yeah, it was very tense and we never had a chance to really like practice things. Like in the Coast Guard, we might do things like a man overboard drill out in the open ocean, because then you get to maneuver the ship around and see how the ship handles and how we can like come back to a life preserver to see if we can, you know, capture that life preserver. Well, I'd rather people become consciously incompetent saving a life preserver that's in the water than when we're actually in, you know, a key situation. So I would say just having those experiences. And the other thing that I haven't really talked about is reflection is one of the most important things we do when we're growing as leaders. So reflecting about, asking someone after an evolution, going back to Jan's example of maybe a coder who's not doing very well, and you go back as the boss and you say, so how do you think that went when we briefed them on that software you developed? And he says, well, I think it went really well. You know, they seem to really love it. They had some great questions. I said, well, tell me more about that, right? Because, you know, if I'm observing this as a failure and this person isn't perceiving it as a failure, I might say, yeah, tell me more about how this was a success, right? And then you start realizing, okay, this person has a really shallow understanding of what success looks like in that environment. And I need to educate them about some of the nuances about, hey, when we're briefing the customer, there's some more to, you know, a successful customer interaction than what you did in that briefing. Did you notice that they said this? Oh yeah, actually, you know, so this is another thing I learned at NextJump that is another powerful concept, right? You guys are triggering some of these memories. This idea of vicarious learning. So Charlie and Megan talked this up, right? When I'm on the spot, right? When I'm being coached, my wheels are spinning and I'm really not in much of a thoughtful mode, right? I'm more reactive. But the people who are watching me are actually learning by hearing the coaches and hearing my responses and realizing, so even if I'm not admitting that I was a complete failure in that last evolution, having people see how unaware I am of that failure or how I'm just not absorbing this feedback is a really key takeaway for people to have in a coaching situation. So I've really embraced that idea of vicarious coaching. So I'll do group coaching sessions with some of my students. And I often now think about, okay, I'm going to put the person who's in the hot seat really in the hot seat. And I'm not so motivated about teaching them as making some awareness for the folks who are watching. So I'm good at long answers to short questions, Dr. Jill. So there you go.
Awesome. And I think we might have time for one more. So I don't know if Margaret Ann is still here. If you want to unmute and ask your question, Margaret Ann. I'm not so sure if she's, oh, here she is. Great.
Yes. Hi, how are you?
Good.
I feel that I don't get enough work. I feel like I am underused, and I feel that work assignments is, I just don't know how to approach it.
Okay, I think I caught most of that, Margaret Ann, and I want to address two things with that. One is, most of us suffer from a lack of feedback in the workplace. So that's an issue, right? If you don't have opportunities to perform and people aren't giving you feedback, and if it's not a safe environment where, the feedback I'm getting is purely developmental, it's not anything that's going to be used against me or, cut into my bonus for the end of the year or any of that. That's a really important thing to think about. And again, culture matters. So, you might want to get a copy of an Everybody Culture and put copies of that around the office to get people to really embrace this idea of deliberately developmental organizations and creating feedback. But the other thing I will say, and Hersey and Blanchard, who I mentioned this earlier, they created the situational leadership model. They said that what followers need to do, a good follower needs to do contracts for leadership with their superiors, with their bosses. So you might take a seminar like this, you know, a lesson. You might say, hey, I just attended this leadership class and I really got intrigued by this concept about, you know, my ability and my motivation or feedback or one of these concepts. And you tell your boss, you know, I really feel like I could be contributing more. I'd like to contract with you to do this, this, and this. And it might be something that's low level, low risk, but it's gonna stretch you. And I'll tell you, it's really a shame that you have to initiate this as a follower. But remember, assume positive intent. Your bosses who aren't challenging you, who aren't, you know, they might be swamped with jobs and you might just be that person who's very accommodating and nice. And they might say, you know what, we don't need to deal with Margaret Ann, so let's just leave her be because, you know, we're dealing with all these other things, right? And as a follower, we don't always know what everyone's dealing with, right? Our bosses, you know, they're not going to go publicly with you to say, yeah, I was just counseling Jerry for the last 4 hours because he's not doing his job. They're not going to tell you that, but just, you know, assume positive intent that they're busy with other things. But then when you come to meet them and say, I've got a plan, and you make it easy for them, and you say, you know, I'm going to stretch myself here. And, you know, even better, if you have one of these super busy bosses, you say, I've even got Jim to agree to mentor me on this. All I need you to do is give me the approval and some acknowledgement that this is a worthwhile task for me, because I don't want to work on busy work, right? You wouldn't want to invent a project that's pure busy work, but you would want to invent something that, or come up with something that's somewhat on the trajectory of where the organization's going. So you might even play around with that vision thing that I talked about. Where are we headed? Well, where are you personally headed? What are you trying to achieve in your career, in your job? And you might say, like, I'm moving from this kind of worker to this kind of worker. And remember, in the motivational stuff, it's not going to be, you know, the bigger salary. It's going to be where you have autonomy, you feel like you're growing, you're getting more masterful, and you have bigger purpose that you're contributing to. So you have to take that initiative, work with your boss, assume positive intent, assume that they're not neglecting you because they don't like you or because they don't care about you. They're probably just super busy with other things and haven't taken time. And maybe they just assume you're great because you haven't been talking and they haven't had to spend much time with you.
And they are super busy. Actually, I have addressed this for the past 4 years now, and my supervisor has taken on this role 4 years ago. And I just feel like it's just being brushed over. My skills are being brushed over.
So I think you need to formalize that a bit. And the other thing I'll say is, you know, like, so I don't get to use all my skills in my job, you know, so like I was super excited to be able to come out to do this thing with NextJump. Last week, I took a week off so that I could do this work with the University of Rhode Island because that's a key skill set. Using technology and being able to teach a different audience, to me, is like really intriguing. So yes, at some point you got to find those little opportunities outside of the work. And it is a shame, you know, that they don't appreciate all of your talents, but you can probably contribute in a volunteer organization or some other way to get those talents tuned up a bit. But I would still encourage you to have a conversation with your boss. And if you've had those conversations and they fall flat, you might even, there's another good book by Carrie Patterson called Crucial Conversations. And there might be a crucial conversation.
I have that book.
You have, okay.
Yes.
So those tough conversations, you need to sometimes instigate or stimulate those tough conversations. And you might even come up with a hypothesis to say, you know, this has been going on for 4 years now. And I've brought this up several times, and I'm starting to get the sense that no one trusts me to be a more effective worker, that no one really feels that I'm capable. And you kind of prime the conversation with that point. And with that, they might come clean. They might feel like, okay, well, she's being vulnerable with us, we're going to be vulnerable with her. But unfortunately, in certain organizations, everyone's walking around with kid gloves. They're walking on eggshells. They don't want to tell people, oh, well, then she's going to file a complaint, right? She's going to give me an HR complaint for being a bad boss. So everybody like handles things with kid gloves. So, you know, I think there's a balance there between being proactive and saying, here's what I want.
Yes.
Being proactive and saying, hey, I need to have a conversation with you because this is like reaching a crescendo for me with frustration. So you tell them that. And then you say, you know, here's what I'm willing to do. I'm willing to put myself out there and risk some things and put in some extra effort. All I need you to do is this, this, and this. You make it easy. And if they're still not willing to do that, you know, it's sad, right? But there's bad leadership everywhere. That's the sad truth of things. And, you know, a lot of it is to do with time. Bosses just don't have the time. to care about their people. And I would argue if you're one of those bosses and you're feeling guilty now because you know what Margaret Ann's saying and you're like, oh geez, I think some of the people I work with might be saying that. You need to create structures where people can get support, not from you, right? You need to create, you know, don't work in a command and control kind of environment where everything starts with you and goes through you. Because if that's the environment you're working in as a leader, you never have enough time, right? But when you share the leadership load and you work more in like a holistic, networked kind of environment, then you're going to have a better approach to how this leadership happens, right? And you're going to have people like Margaret who you're not going to be able to take care of them, but they're going to have a network where they can get taken care of and meet some of their needs, not through the boss. Because oftentimes the boss is not the person. Again, you know, I hate to keep singing their praises, but the whole idea of talking partners that NextJump has, it's a network of people you can count on so that you can, you know, interact and bring out some great stuff. So I'll end with, you know, related to that, the Gallup folks did a book called First Break All the Rules years ago. And in that book, they had these 12 essential questions that they said, if you can, you know, assess your organization on these 12 questions, it'll really be a key indicator of how healthy the organization is. And one of the questions, and I don't remember all 12, but one of the questions that really struck home with a lot of people, and a lot of people thought it was really quirky, was this question of, I have a best friend at work. So do you have a best friend at work? And the idea was that if I have someone that I can confide in, that I can talk to and relate with, I'm going to be happier at work because I'll have a way to vent. I'll also have someone who can kind of call me on things and say, hey, you know, you're complaining too much, or, hey, you know, I watched you in that presentation. You thought you did good. You really didn't do good, right? So this idea of talking partners and the power of two people working together, or even triads, is really powerful, right? So as bosses, if we can set up systems where those things are in place, then there's less on us as leaders to be this person who always has to answer everyone's personal need. So that's another, you know, answer to this. You know, there's no answer that's simple to this, but just apply some of those key principles. And the other thing I'll say, Margaret, is if you do that "Who am I" slide idea, and you do your personality and like do a personality assessment, do a values priority assessment. What's probably most frustrating to you is your values are here and what you're being called upon at work is here, and there's this, you know, dissonance. So you just personally have to take care of yourself, right? And what's going to make you more motivated and happy with your work life. So, you know, that's my my answer to your really tough question, right?
Oh, thank you so much. I wish I could keep sitting at your feet. There's so much wisdom in this.
I have to answer to my wife on all this. If she sees the video, she's going to say, why don't you start doing some of that stuff that you talk about? Because the reality is it's a lot easier to talk about. And we say, you know, this is simple concepts, but it's not easy to do, right? We're trying to make common sense, common practice. And it's hard, right? We all fall off of that all the time. And what I say is you recover quicker, if you know these concepts and you embrace the concepts. So you have a quicker recovery time when you embrace some of these key concepts.
Yeah, how often do we practice what we preach?
Right. Hopefully we remember enough. And I would say you need memory joggers, right? That bring you back to those key ideas of your, you know, if you can. So here's another thing, you know, putting out your leadership philosophy and what are your top values, that's going to make you more accountable to those, right?
Yes.
You're like, now everybody knows that I think this is important, so I better not be doing that. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Very
this
nice
is
meeting you.
awesome.